Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm here today with yet another conversation about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this is my 12th conversation with you on this book. Now remember, the project of these lectures is not to just lecture you, but to read the book with you. So I strongly urge you to get any edition of the book, an online edition, and read along so that we can learn together. Now, in the previous lecture, if you watched it, I strongly urge you to do so. We had left our conversation on page 65, right, where he's talking about the passivity and emotional dependence of the oppressed. How does it come to be? And the need for defining a praxis. Praxis for Freire depends on two things: reflection and action. Reflection on one's lived conditions, knowing why the world is the way it is on the part of the peasants, on the part of the oppressed, and then working in solidarity to change that, right? To change the world as it is. So that's where we are starting from page 65, middle of the page. I will finish the chapter today because the last page is 69. But here, let's read the next couple of paragraphs and then I'll come back to you to talk about it. Critical and liberating dialogue, which presupposes action, must be carried on with the oppressed at whatever the stage of their struggle for liberation. The content of that dialogue can and should vary in accordance with historical conditions and the level at which the oppressed perceive reality. But to substitute monologue, slogans, and communiques for a dialogue is to attempt to liberate the oppressed with the instruments of domestication. Attempting to liberate the oppressed without their reflective participation in the act of liberation is to treat them as object which must be saved from a burning building. It is to lead them into the populist pitfall and transform them into masses which can be manipulated. At all stages of their liberation, the oppressed must see themselves as women and men engaged in the ontological and historical vocation of becoming more fully human. Reflection and action become imperative when one does not erroneously attempt to dichotomize the content of humanity from its historical forms. The insistence that the oppressed engaged in reflection on their concrete situation is not a call to armchair revolution. On the contrary, true reflection leads to action. On the other hand, when the situation calls for action, that all action will constitute an authentic praxis only if its consequences become the object of critical reflection. In this sense, the praxis is the new raison d'etre of the oppressed, and the revolution which inaugurates the historical moment of this raison d'etre is not viable apart from their concomitant conscious involvement. Otherwise, action is pure activism. To achieve this praxis, however, it is necessary to trust in the oppressed and in their ability to reason. Whoever lacks this trust will fail to initiate or will abandon dialogue, reflection, and communication, and will fall into using slogans, communiques, monologues, and instructions. Superficial conversion to the cause of liberation carry this danger. So let us think of what I just read. What we are getting from this is a distinction between uncritical populism and a real praxis of liberation. And a praxis of liberation becomes mere activism and populism when it is hijacked first of all, by someone who claims to speak for the people. When it is top down, like communiques and instructions, they come from top down, where someone claims that he or she alone can solve the problems of the masses and uses the energy of the masses to achieve their end. So what Freire is forestalling here is any possibility of an attempt by the elite or any individual or a group of individuals taking over the liberatory process. And one indicator of it is always when any constituency or group assumes that they have all the answers and people need to be liberated, because then they are treating the people as things, as not having a volition of their own. True liberation, of course, according to the passages that I just read, and generally what comes across in this book, is based in reflection, right? Reflection on the part of the oppressed themselves, on their lived conditions, on the injustices in the society, right? And then that is mobilized into action, right? So the reason, the raison d'etre, the reason of its being then, right? What is it? In this sense, the praxis is the new raison d'etre of the oppressed and the revolution, right? Praxis. And how does he define praxis? A combination of reflection within the historical context, as he says, within the situation where a particular group of the oppressed might exist, but reflection on that, but a critical reflection of understanding their own situation, understanding what is going on, but not just mere reflection, not armchair politics, right? Then mobilizing that reflection in solidarity with others into action to change things. And remember, whenever we are talking about change in Freire, the change is geared towards realization of full humanity by the oppressed. A humanity in which they are equal with others, in which they have all their rights, right? And in which they can live as free citizens of the world, right? What else also comes across is that to achieve this praxis, all constituencies have to believe that the oppressed have the mental capacities, the intellectual capacities to reason, to think about their own lived condition, and not necessarily that they are dumb and they are objects and they need to be taught or instructed. So dialogue, what he means by a dialogue is that all the constituencies, even if you have joined the movement from the ranks of the oppressor class, must dialogue with the knowledge that the oppressed can think for themselves, that they should think for themselves, they should reflect, and a praxis so developed would then have the input of the oppressed in their own liberation, right? If that's not involved, then it becomes a kind of populist politics in which demagogues, dictators, can mobilize the popular sentiment in the name of liberating the people without making any structural changes, right? And convert them into masses, right? And that's what Freire is trying to teach us should not happen, because superficial conversion to the cause of liberation carries this danger, right? So if someone uncritically joins it or appropriates it, and if in the process the oppressed themselves are not reflecting and trying to change the imbalance which creates them into objects, right, then all that's happening is that one or two people or a political party or a group is appropriating the sentiment of the oppressed, converting them into this mass movement which enables them to gain power, but which doesn't necessarily change the unequal system. So we are towards the end of the first chapter now, right? We are now going into the subtleties of what is praxis, what must it not do, right? What's the role of reflection and action? What is mere activism? Mere activism is an activism that has no reflection behind it, that has no dialogue behind it, right? Between different constituencies. Because in the next chapter, he will move on to then actually giving us the pedagogy of the oppressed and how must it be done. So I will read on and then I'll come back and talk about the further reading a little more. Political action on the side of the oppressed must be pedagogical action in the authentic sense of the word, and therefore action with the oppressed. Those who work for liberation must not take advantage of the emotional dependence of the oppressed, dependence that is the fruit of the concrete situation of domination which surrounds them and which engendered their unauthentic view of the world. Using their dependence to create still greater dependence is an oppressor tactic. Libertarian action must recognize this dependence as a weak point and must attempt through reflection and action to transform it into independence. However, not even the best-intentioned leadership can bestow independence as a gift. The liberation of the oppressed is a liberation of women and men, not things. Accordingly, while no one liberates himself for his own efforts alone, neither is he liberated by others. Liberation, a human phenomenon, cannot be achieved by semi-humans. Any attempt to treat people as semi-humans only dehumanizes them. When people are already dehumanized due to the oppression they suffer, the process of their liberation must not employ the methods of dehumanization. The correct method for a revolutionary leadership to employ in the task of liberation is therefore not libertarian propaganda, nor can the leadership merely implant in the oppressed a belief in freedom, thus thinking to win their trust. The correct method lies in dialogue. The conviction of the oppressed that they must fight for their liberation is not a gift bestowed by the revolutionary leadership, but the result of their own conscientiousako or conscientiousaka. The revolutionary leaders must realize that their own conviction of the necessity for struggle, an indispensable dimension of revolutionary wisdom, was not given to them by anyone else if it is authentic. This conviction cannot be packaged and sold. It is reached rather by means of a totality of reflection and action. Only the leader's own involvement in reality within an historical situation led them to criticize this situation and to wish to change it. Likewise, the oppressed who do not commit themselves to the struggle unless they are convinced, and who, if they do not make such a commitment, withhold the indispensable conditions for this struggle, must reach this conviction as subjects, not as objects. They also must intervene critically in the situation which surrounds them and whose mark they bear. Propaganda cannot achieve this, while the conviction of the necessity for struggle, without which the struggle is unfeasible, is indispensable to the revolutionary leadership. Indeed, it was this conviction which constituted that leadership. It is also necessary for the oppressed. It is necessary, that is, unless one intends to carry out the transformation for the oppressed rather than with them. Transformation for the oppressed rather than with them. It is my belief that only the latter form of transformation is valid. The object in presenting these consideration is to defend the eminently pedagogical character of the revolution. The revolutionary leaders of every epoch who have affirmed that the oppressed must accept the struggle for their liberation, an obvious point, have also thereby implicitly recognized the pedagogical aspect of this struggle. Many of these leaders, however, perhaps due to natural and understandable biases against pedagogy, have ended up using the educational methods employed by the oppressors. They deny pedagogical action in the liberation process, but they use propaganda to convince. Okay, so we are reaching the end of chapter 1, right? So in this part, he's still focusing on the difference between authentic resistance and leadership and inauthentic propaganda-based, what he calls libertarian ideology. So libertarian struggle then for him can never be authentic as long as it is driven top-down and relies on propaganda where it mobilizes the people to achieve certain ends without changing the larger structures in which people exist. And important in this reading is the term conscientization, right, or conscientization, coming to consciousness. Now, Freire discusses this at length in chapter 3, but in the preface of the book, the term conscientization refers to learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions, and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality, right? So that means that it's the kind of consciousness that is not just fact-based, but that it also helps people realize the historical, social, and political conditions in which one lives. Another important thing that came out from these passages that I just read, is the question of pedagogy. Now, for Freire, then, any revolutionary movement is a pedagogical process. And the reason it's a pedagogical process is, after all, because what are we trying to accomplish, as he explains? What we are trying to accomplish is, first of all, humanization of the very people who had been dehumanized. Then, these people who now have rehumanized themselves through reflection and praxis, and not through top-down teaching, right, are the ones who are going to lead the struggle to change the larger system in which they have existed, right? This cannot be done through mere propaganda where someone comes along and mobilizes the people towards change. People must reach this consciousness in solidarity with others. And when they do that by looking at their own life, by critically, revolution then becomes a pedagogical project, because in the process of revolutionary change, people first become human and then claim their place in the world. Think of most revolutionary movements, or even, pragmatic movements. What they tell us is that let us help us change the world, and once it is changed, you will have a better place in it. No, the purpose of this revolutionary pedagogy is to reconcile people, according to Freire, with their own humanity. And they cannot wait until the end of the revolution to reach there. The first step is for them to realize their equal humanity, claim it, and then launch the revolutionary change. The project is pedagogical because for the peasants, for the oppressed, it is pedagogical because they are discovering their own lived conditions and how have their selves been constructed. But then they are also teaching the leadership what they feel, how do they think, right? And not simply learning top down, right? And the mistake, what he's saying is, most revolutionary leaders make is that in their attempt to train the workers, in their attempt to educate the peasants, they employ the same top-down methods. They come from outside and say, here, if you do this, this is a solution to your problems. It's kind of the similar vein as the role of the organic intellectual, who might have the knowledge, but who go and lives with the people, learns from them, and shares his or her own knowledge with them, but never tries to tell the people, this is how we do things, and if you do it my way, you will learn it. Or in case of politics, it's never someone instigating the people to rise without humanizing them, but only instrumentalizing them. That's a subtle difference between uncritical populism, top-down populism, propagandistic politics. Now remember, propaganda was a major part in the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution and later on as well. So there is an explicit critique of that kind of communism and Marxism, right? And what else came through? Okay, so that's all the thoughts I have about the passages I just read. And then we'll go and read the concluding passage of this chapter, and I'll come back and talk to you a little more about that. For the oppressed to realize that when they accept the struggle for humanization, they also accept from that moment their total responsibility for the struggle. They must realize that they are fighting not merely for freedom from hunger, but for, and this is a quote from Erich Fromm, freedom to create and to construct, to wonder and to venture. Such freedom requires that the individual be active and responsible, not a slave or well-fed cog in the machine. It is not enough that men are not slaves. If social conditions further the existence of automations, the result will not be love of life, but love of death. End of quote. The oppressed, who have been shaped by the death-affirming climate of oppression, must find through their struggle the way to life-affirming humanization, which does not lie simply in having more to eat, although it does involve having more to eat and cannot fail to include this aspect. The oppressed have been destroyed precisely because their situation has reduced them to things. In order to regain their humanity, they must cease to be things and fight as men and women. This is a radical requirement. They cannot enter the struggle as objects in order later to become human beings. The struggle begins with men's recognition that they have been destroyed. Propaganda, management, manipulation, all arms of domination cannot be the instruments of their rehumanization. The only effective instrument is a humanizing pedagogy in which the revolutionary leadership establishes a permanent relationship of dialogue with the oppressed. In a humanizing pedagogy, the method ceases to be an instrument by which the teachers, in this instance the revolutionary leadership, can manipulate the students, in this instance the oppressed, because it expresses the consciousness of the students themselves. The method is, in fact, the external form of consciousness manifest in acts, which takes on the fundamental property of consciousness, its intentionality. And this is also a quote from Alvaro Vieira Pinto, and he's quoting from there the method. The quote starts here. The method is in fact the external form of consciousness manifests in act which takes on the fundamental property of consciousness, its intentionality. The essence of consciousness is being with the world, and this behavior is permanent and unavoidable. Accordingly, consciousness is in essence a way toward something apart from itself, outside of itself, which surrounds it and which it apprehends by means of its ideational capacity. Consciousness is thus by definition a method in the most general sense of the word. End of quote. A revolutionary leadership must accordingly practice co-intentional education. Teachers and students, leadership and people, co-intent on reality are both subjects, not only in the task of unveiling that reality and thereby coming to know it critically, but in the task of recreating that knowledge. As they attain this knowledge of reality through common reflection and action, they discover themselves as its permanent recreators. In this way, the presence of the oppressed in the struggle for their liberation will be what it should be, not pseudo-participation, but committed involvement. Okay, so with this final reading of these few passages, we have reached the end of chapter 1. And what's instructive in the last part that I just read is the quote, because it is about consciousness, right? And this is a phenomenological take on consciousness. Remember, in Husserl's phenomenology, thought is always outward tending, right? So reflection is never just reflection about oneself. It's never, in that Cartesian sense, thinking from within, right? Since thought is always outward tending, right? So that means that the oppressed think when they reflect, they are thinking outwardly about the world in which they exist, right? And if those who want to work with them, those in the position of leadership, if it is a pedagogical relationship, it becomes pedagogy of the oppressed when both the teacher and the students are co-intentional, which means is they are thinking outward about the world, but they are thinking together with each other, right? That's what being co-intentional means, right? Thought intended outwards, but also a thought in which the student is not the object of that thought, right? So the pedagogical thought doesn't go seeking this passive student and fill it. It's a pedagogical practice in which both the teacher and the student, the leader and the so-called led, are thinking together, intending the change that they want to come about in the world, right? What also comes clear in this part of the chapter is also his emphasis on humanizing pedagogy. That if pedagogy is meant to humanize people, it cannot use the strategies that were used to dehumanize people, right? So then it cannot be a pedagogy that based in the same old top-down model in which the teacher has all the knowledge and the student doesn't think. A student just reproduces the knowledge offered by the teacher. And you can apply it to the political situations. It cannot then be a kind of politics in which the leadership or a cadre of leadership or a single leader are the one who have all the answers, right? And people must follow. So not only is he articulating a practical pedagogy, a liberating pedagogy, but there is a lot other things that we are learning in this chapter and eventually in the book. And one of them is to rid ourselves of our micro-fascisms, right? What is a micro-fascism according to Deleuze? When any one of us looks around and hopes, oh, I wish we had better leaders. I wish someone would lead us out of it. That's a micro-fascism that we all have internalized, right? Instead of thinking that we can be the catalyst for change and that we can come up with things ourselves, looking outwards, and then finding more people in our own lived conditions in solidarity, and then bring it to the world and change it. Why do we keep thinking that someone needs to come and liberate us? That is the dehumanization at work. Right? So by the end of the chapter then, and let me read the last few sentences, a revolutionary leadership must accordingly practice co-intentional education. Teachers and students, co-intent on reality, are both subjects, not only in the task of unveiling that reality and thereby coming to know it critically, but in the task of recreating that knowledge. So co-intention. So the teachers and students are doing two things. They are together thinking the world in which they exist critically. That's reflection, right? Reflection based in knowing the world around it, how it works, what are its injustices, and then praxis, attempting to change it. So by the end of the chapter, we have learned what the project of education is to humanize the oppressed, the process of how we would get there, and that it's a pedagogical practice, and the pedagogy must be co-intentional, in which the students are not passives and teachers are not givers of all the knowledge. So that's where my reading of chapter 1 ends. Now, what do you think it teaches us about our current world and current situation? Do you have any opinions about it? I would love to hear your opinions in the comments about what we have covered in these 12 lectures. Now, I'm not done with chapter 1. I will now, after this reading part of chapter 1, record a brief lecture which would give you a summary of chapter 1. What are the major things that we learned, that we discussed, and then after that, we will move on to chapter 2. I hope this has been a useful experience to me. It has been wonderful, certainly for me, to reread Freire and rethink my own practices. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. It helps me because more of you can come and interact with me, but also it will keep you informed as to what is coming next. And also, if you're interested in learning these things in a more formalistic setting, we now have a full website, Cross-Cultural Learning, where we are developing different courses in humanities. Please do check it out. The website address is masoodraja.com. That's all I have to say in this. Thank you so much for your time and for joining me. And I am really deeply grateful to you all because you all keep me going, keep me motivated, and thank you for that. With that, thank you. I'll be back next time, and until then, peace and love.